this is an extremely capable, dedicated, wise group of activists we have working on the issues associated with Fukushima, Indian Point, Oyster Creek, and all the other nuclear facilities in this country. Again, my organization is Hudson River Keeper. Hudson River Keeper was formed 46 years ago to protect the Hudson River, and since then we've broadened our mission to involve protecting the drinking water supply for 9 million New Yorkers, a drinking water supply that would be very severely compromised in any accident involving Indian Point. We've been focusing on the Indian Point issue because of its impacts on marine populations for decades. But in the wake of 9/11, we realized that we're not only in it to protect the fish, there's a very serious risk to the people of this region from nuclear energy at Indian Point. And so we've dedicated ourselves to opposing the relicensing of Indian Point, which I believe is why I'm here this morning as the moderator. But today's panel is why we're really here. It's an extraordinary group of people, a former head of state who faced the world's largest and most severe nuclear disaster, a man who was the chief regulator of America's nuclear industry during that crisis, with responsibilities for Americans who were in proximity to Fukushima at the time of the disaster. Another man who spent 40 years as an insider in the industry, giving him unique perspective on all of this. A former nuclear regulator during America's most significant nuclear crisis. And joining us later on this morning, our country's leading public advocate, who has been called one of the 100 most influential figures in American history. Now, at this point, I think that it is my great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker, former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan.
このようにわずか4日間の間に3つの原子炉がメルトスローを起こし、また4つの原発が水素爆発を起こすというこういう事故はもちろん世界で初めてであります。
So within 4 days, 3 of the 4 reactors had either melt down or melt through, and 4 of them had hydrogen explosions. And there was no such severe accident, before, historically speaking.
私はこの事故が起きて1週間の間、夜も総理の執務室に防災服を着てとどまっておりました。
During those days, I just stayed at my office overnight and every night, and wearing those, the emergency response sort of a garb, and I just stayed there.
私が考えていたのはただ一つ、この事故がどこまで拡大するのか、そして、どうやればその拡大を止めることができるのか、さらに拡大したときにどこまでの人が逃げなければならないのか、そのことを常に考えておりました。
What was going through my mind at the time? How far is this going? How worse is this going to get? And how can we stop this from getting worse? And how far do we have to evacuate people? How far are people going to be affected?
には東京を含む大きな範囲から人々を避難させなければならなくなると、こう考えました。
And I fear that in that foreseeable, there was a possibility that the area, including Tokyo, might be affected. We might have to evacuate so many people.
の状況は原発事故によって生まれた汚染した水がその地下水と混ざって、そしてその一部が 海に流れて出ているんではないかというこういう心配が今も続いております。
So our concern today is that the radioactive particles from those broken reactors are now mixed in with the groundwater, and some of that is leaching into the ocean.
私自身、3.11 の福島原発事故が起きるまでは、原発については安全性をしっかり確認した上でそれを活用する、そのことを私自身もそうすべきだと考え、そういう立場で臨んでおりました。
My position before March 11th, 2011 was that as long as we make sure that the safety, it's safely operated, nuclear power plant can be operated and should be operated.
しかし 3.11 の事故を経験してから私は考え方を180度変えました。
However, after experiencing the disaster of March 11th, I changed my thinking 180 degrees completely.
飛行機事故や他の事故で、何百人という人が一度に亡くなることはあります。しかし、5000万人もの人が逃げ出さなければならなくなるといったような事故は戦争以外ではこの原発事故を除いてはありません。
You know, we do have accidents such as say airplane crash and so on, and sometimes hundreds of people die in an accident, but there is no other accident or disaster that would affect 50 million people, maybe a war, but there is no other accident can cause such a tragedy.
For all of you who live in the New York City area, you can imagine what it's like to have to deal with this by thinking about the Superstorm Sandy that hit New York City recently. During that storm, parts of New York City were left without power for weeks. Now imagine multiplying that and taking those weeks and turning those into years. Imagine having to be outside of your home not for weeks while power was restored, but perhaps permanently. To never see anymore the home where you've marked the growth of your children, the life important lessons and events that have marked your life and those of your family and your friends and all of your community. Imagine having to have that taken from you for a period of time that is undetermined. That is the tragedy and the human toll that the accident of Fukushima has enacted on nearly 100,000 people in Japan. You cannot put those impacts into dollar terms. You cannot put those impacts into terms that are easy to discuss or easy to measure. But they are very real, and it is one of the most difficult aspects of this accident and one of the most important issues that we have to keep in mind. Now, stepping aside from those difficult challenges that we have a hard time measuring, there are real measurable impacts from the accident at Fukushima Daiichi. There is the significant land contamination and the economic impact that has occurred in Japan. 30% of the country's electricity is not available in the usual manner because of the shutdown of all of the nuclear power plants as a result of the accident. And an estimate that was done in 2012 by an independent organization, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, they concluded in their report, and this is a direct quote, that the current rough estimate of the total cost to Japan from the Fukushima Daiichi accident is about $500 billion US. And this is perhaps the most important piece of this statement, which will substantially increase if nuclear electricity generation continues to be replaced for a long time by other means. And of course, that's the situation now that is happening in Japan. So $500 billion is the minimum cost and impact of this accident in Japan. Three of these very significant, perhaps some of the most significant lessons that were learned from the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and talk to you about where those lessons are today. The first is the seismic reevaluations that are being done for nuclear power plants in this country. The incident at the Fukushima Daiichi site was fundamentally an earthquake which created a tsunami. To this day, it's unclear exactly how much the earthquake or the tsunami contributed. Clearly, we know the tsunami had a tremendous effect, but there may in fact have been impacts from the earthquake itself. So you would think that this is an issue, and especially given the earthquake that we saw in Virginia, this is an issue that would get the utmost attention from a technologically sophisticated industry. But when I was chairman at the NRC, one of the complaints I heard from the industry repeatedly was that there were not enough experts to go back and reassess and reanalyze the seismic impacts on nuclear power plants. Well, my first thinking was, shouldn't we have been doing this all along? Why all of a sudden now do we have to hire all these people to now go out and conduct these assessments and these analyses? Why isn't this something that was being done on a routine and regular basis? Unfortunately, it wasn't. So the latest plan for implementing modifications and taking the best available science about seismic events and how they affect nuclear power plants is to essentially put off this work for another 6 or 7 years. The current schedule, which was recently this fall proposed by the industry and ultimately endorsed by the staff of the NRC, was to say that we'll begin a process of making modifications to plants that will be done sometime by December 2016. And those would be for modifications to the facilities that don't require the plants to actually go into an outage. And mind you, these are not modifications based on the best science, the best technical assessment. These are a so-called deterministic assessment, which is basically the kind of approach that's used today. Now, that's just the very first piece, and those are the, I guess you could call those the low-hanging fruit. The real modifications, the changes that could actually impact plant operations, are those things that would require an outage to conduct. The proposal is to have another up to 2 outages to conduct those modifications. 2 outages is generally anywhere between 3 and 4 more years to complete those activities. So we're looking at December 2017 to December 2018 to have those modifications made. Now, the truly sophisticated assessments, the best way to understand how seismic events can affect a nuclear power plant, some of those assessments won't even be done until 2020, let alone the plant modifications that could come out of this. Now, I bring this up because this should have been one of the most highest priority issues that should have been completed from the post-Fukushima lessons learned. And at the time, when I was chairman, I challenged the industry. I said, we should set a goal. We should all be able to agree on a simple goal. Let's implement all of these lessons within 5 years. No industry wants to spend the next 10 years or more dealing with an accident and the ramifications from an accident that happened in 2011. And I challenged the industry to do that. Unfortunately, that challenge will not be met.
We must remember one thing here. The uranium mines, the uranium radioactive tailings around those mines, the development of the fuel rods, the transportation to the location where the nuclear plant is, the creation of these nuclear plants with enormous complexities, the production of radioactive waste, which still do not have a permanent waste disposal, and all the problems appurtenant to a deadly substance that had to be 100% controlled. 99% is not enough. It was a technology that had one bite of the apple. All of this and the storage for tens of thousands of years of radioactive waste had one purpose: to boil water, to produce steam, or other reactor designs to produce heat. Now, the question that was very rarely asked in secret congressional hearings was, aren't there other ways to boil water without all the continuum of risk involved in the nuclear fuel cycle? It's often said that nuclear power is needed because of the climate change. Number one, you need a lot of coal to burn to enrich the uranium. That's often not mentioned. Number two, as Amory Lovins has said repeatedly, if you take the investment in nuclear and put it in solar, renewable, other forms of renewable and conservation, you'd get far more BTUs, far more efficiently, far more safely, and far more benignly for climate change. It's unevacuable, and this comes to Indian Point. Any nuclear plant that does not have a live drill to make sure that its evacuation plan is anything other than a fantasy plan cannot be allowed to operate. Indian Point is 30 miles or so north of Manhattan, much closer to New York City than Fukushima is to Tokyo. There is no practical evacuation plan that could work in that area. Not just 10 miles out, 20, 30 miles, 50 miles, you have 19 million people. People can hardly get out of New York City at rush hour time. Can anybody credibly present a scenario where, given our transportation lockups and the density of population and the panic that would occur and the lack of any drills, the lack of any practice other than paper models, that area around Indian Point can be evacuated? And as you know, Indian Point has been rife with problems, replete with waivers, near active earthquake zones, aging, decaying. Indian Point 1 shut down years ago. Indian Point 2 and 3 up for recertification.
Well, every day at Fairwinds, we get emails saying it can't possibly be that the American plants are as bad as the Fukushima Daiichi. And I thought I'd look briefly at the condition of Indian Point and compare it to Daiichi. And in many ways, Indian Point is actually worse than Fukushima Daiichi was the day before the accident. The first issue, as was alluded to already, is emergency planning with a population center as close as New York City is to Indian Point. You know, Tokyo was 120 miles away from Fukushima Daiichi. Indian Point is 26 miles up the road. Also, the Japanese were the best at emergency planning in the world. They really took emergency planning seriously. And yet the entire emergency planning system collapsed as a consequence of a severe accident where all the safety systems collapsed. If the Japanese couldn't do emergency planning right, I don't think anybody in the world can. The second thing is the condition of the spent fuel pool. Indian Point has 5 times more nuclear fuel in its spent fuel pool than does Daiichi. Indian Point has the equivalent of every bomb that was ever fired above ground in the above ground testing phases. That much radiation is in the pools at Indian Point and is not being moved to dry cask storage. The Japanese moved a lot of fuel to dry cask storage. The Japanese had about 7 years of nuclear fuel in Daiichi, whereas Indian Point has over 30. The third thing is we all know that the common view of the accident is that the Daiichi's accident was caused by an earthquake followed by a tsunami. But really what happened was this: the earthquake knocked down the power lines that fed the plant. And so that's called the loss of offsite power. Then the tsunami came in and wiped out the cooling pumps along the water. It also wiped out the diesels. But even if the diesels had not been wiped out, the cooling pumps along the water were. That's called the loss of the ultimate heat sink, because you need that water to cool your diesels. So that creates something that Chairman Yasko talked about, was this station blackout. And a nuclear plant is designed to withstand that for about 4 to 8 hours. Now, can that happen at Indian Point? The answer is yes. 2 people dedicated to dying as terrorists could cause a loss of offsite power by shooting the transmission lines, and also drive a high-powered boat with explosives into the intake structure, which would cause a loss of the ultimate heat sink. 2 terrorists could create the same problem that we experienced at Fukushima Daiichi. I wrote about this 2 years ago in my book, but other people have been talking about this for years, and the NRC has done nothing to prevent the accident from getting any worse.
The argument one hears often is, well, the strategy we have to pursue is all of the above. That the problem of climate change is so urgent that we just have to throw everything at it. Well, think about that. That's not how we solve problems. We don't, for example, go after world hunger by placing a big bet on caviar. And there's a fundamental logical economic reason for that, which is that if you bet on your most expensive options, you're not going to be able to buy enough of what it is that you need. And that's the reason why it seems to me that a heavy bet on new nuclear, that in particular the environmental communities, those in the environmental community who are tempted by the prospect that nuclear power is low carbon, are barking up a wrong tree and need to reevaluate how they think about choosing among the low carbon options that are available to us.